Hi, I'm Brian Adam. When we think about a whole chain traceability system, and as we've talked with colleagues and others in the industry, some ask, what makes you think that the system you've developed at OSU is any better than previous systems that have failed? A good example of systems that have failed is the USDA National Animal Identification System. And research by ag economists has shown that there were several reasons that that system failed. One is that producers were concerned about a lack of privacy or confidentiality. They were concerned that putting information, their personal information about their animals into the system would be used by competitors or even potential collaborators in the system, not for their benefit, but to compete against them. And so they were concerned that putting their information into the system would not be good for them, and thus they chose not to participate. A second reason is that producers perceived that their costs would be greater than the benefits. And in fact, their perception was at least partly true, because the research showed that most of the cost would be borne by those earlier in the supply chain, such as cow-calf producer, whereas others later in the supply chain, such as feedlots and processors, would be the ones who benefit more from whole chain traceability. Not to mention, as the research has shown, that society as a whole benefits and industry as a whole benefits. But the problem is that the individual producers, in many cases, would have to pay more than they would get in return for participating in the whole chain traceability system. The system we've developed at OSU, we believe, addresses these concerns, lack of confidentiality and costs being greater than benefits, by creating a system that adds value and that allows producers to remain confidential and for their information to remain confidential. In previous systems, producers had to put all their information in, and then everybody in the supply chain could see that information. And so producers rightly were concerned that others would have access to their information and they would be able to use that information against them as potential competitors. But the OSU system addresses that by allowing those who put the information into the system, each stage of the supply chain, allows those producers to choose who sees what pieces of information. For example, the cow-calf producer might choose to put in information such as animal ID, location of the animal, and antibiotics that have been used. Then when he sells that calf to the stocker, he chooses to show the stocker only the information on animal ID, but not the information on location and antibiotics. The stocker himself puts in information such as animal ID, location, antibiotics, average daily gain, any other piece of information that the stocker wants to provide. Then when the stocker animal is sold to the feeder is allowed to see by the cow-calf producer the animal ID and antibiotics, but not location. None of the information that the stocker has put into the system is allowed to be seen by the feeder. And then the feeder puts in his own information, such as animal ID, location, antibiotics, perhaps average daily gain. Then when the animal is sold to the processor gets to see the information on antibiotics from the cow-calf producer, the information on antibiotics from the stocker, and the information on antibiotics from the feeder, and then puts in his own information on yield grade and quality grade that could go back to the cow-calf producer or to any others in the supply chain. But the point is that only those people who put the information in can choose who sees what pieces of information. These two features, confidentiality of information and value-added opportunities for producers in the supply chain, were key objectives as we developed our pilot system of whole chain traceability at OSU. As we move forward, we'll be looking for industry sponsors and participants to make this system fully operational.